when we talk about privilege, we're not talking about having a privileged background or having grown up wealthy. That's economically privileged. That's one way of using the word privilege. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that there are a certain category of microaggressions, a certain category of oppressive policies that you just don't have to worry about by virtue of some aspect of your identity.
Hello, and welcome to the Affirming Practice Podcast. Today's episode, we're talking about power, privilege, and oppression. I'm Dr. Casey Ann Brimmer. I use they, them pronouns. I'm an artist, activist, and educator who's been talking about these issues for more than 20 years.
And I'm Pastor Bob Irian. I use he, him pronouns. I am a cishet white guy who happens to love and care about LGBTQ people and believe that they ought to be treated like, human beings. And I get to be part of this with Dr. Diz, and I'm really grateful for that.
Together, we're the hosts of the Affirming Practice Podcast, a podcast to guide everyday people in everyday actions to build a more affirming world within their reach. So today's episode is power, privilege, oppression. I want to start with some definitions, like how we're using these phrases, and feel free to interrupt and add on as you see fit.
Mm-hmm.
Privilege is not having to think about something. You can have privilege in one area of your life and not in other areas of your life. So when we say white privilege, we mean you have privilege based off your whiteness. If you have cisgender privilege or cis privilege, you have privilege because you are cisgender or you identify with the sex you were assigned at birth. Power is the ability to control systems and or resources, the authority to set en masse institutional expectations. Power is usually granted as a privilege, so people who are privileged have power, but it also grants privilege. And oppressed identities are without or with less power and privilege, marginalized, minoritized, even subjugated by those with power.
To be clear, that when we talk about privilege, we're not talking about having a privileged background or having grown up wealthy. That's economically privileged. That's one way of using the word privilege. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that there are a certain category of microaggressions, a certain category of oppressive policies that you just don't have to worry about by virtue of some aspect of your identity. So, for instance, I am a cisgender, heterosexual, white, male Christian, which means that in this country, that's at least 5 levels of privilege I don't even have to think about. Like those are working before I even get out of bed in the morning, is the way I describe it. And yes, being Christian in a country that still skews heavily Christian does convey a certain amount of privilege. Like calendars, like holidays. Like I don't have to worry about whether or not the holy days of my religion are going to be holidays for the broader culture. They just are, right? And nobody's going to look at me weird if I say, yeah, I'm not working because that's a holiday for my religion. And it's not to say that, Christians have more legal privileges or legal protections, because constitutionally we're not supposed to. Culturally, we have things we don't have to worry about that, for instance, my Sikh neighbor at the end of the street does. I mean, he has to think about those things. He has to wonder, when he leaves the house, if somebody's going to see his turban, which is a part of his religious expression, and assume that that means he's a terrorist.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if I walk out of the house wearing, I don't know, a beretta, which is a type of religious headgear that some Christians wear, nobody's going to assume that, that means I'm a terrorist going on my way to blow up a building.
Yeah.
And to be clear, neither is he, but we live in a world full of ignorant people, and that is part of where the privilege comes from.
Yeah, definitely. So you jumped ahead of me a little bit, and I love that you did, but I'm resetting my brain. So in episode 6, we discussed intersectionality.
Mhm.
And one of the views of intersectionality was how systems of power and oppression intersect to create an individual social location. And today we're elaborating on that. So you just listed off a host of identities that you have that convey privilege. And the thing to look at, and you've also already mentioned this, is that how those intersect with areas where we are oppressed or where we face challenges, things that we have to think about. Like that's what we're elaborating on today. So one of my questions for today for us to think about is what are our privileged identities and how do those kind of play out in the real world? And so for me, my whiteness informed my access to education. It informs my role as a teacher. It informs how people receive the information I am offering, even in this podcast. It informs my socioeconomic class because white folks get paid at higher rates, like statistically, but my gender also informs that. And as someone assigned female at birth, I am more likely to get paid less than you are as a white male.
Yep.
And a woman of color is likely to get paid less than I am as a white gender minority. Um, it informs my ability to get work. I don't have to worry about changing my name on my resume. And there's studies about how you can send out, like, people assume a white sounding name and or see a white sounding name, and that person gets pushed up to the front of the line.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it also informs things like my access to an autism and ADHD diagnosis
Mm-hmm.
and my access to healthcare. And if I had chosen to pursue having children biologically, it would have informed the like my maternity death rates. And so my whiteness informs every step of what I'm doing and it informs all of these other parts of my experience. And so do areas where I'm oppressed. My autism and ADHD inform all of these things as well. For example, just looking at this podcast, my autism informs that because gender and sexuality is my autistic special interest. I'm fascinated by it. And I've been fascinated by it and like hyper focused on this topic for literal decades. Even before I knew I was autistic, it was informed by that. My disabilities inform things like my disabilities, my gender, those inform how doctors perceive me and perceive what I ask for and what I need and how I have to self advocate. But so does my whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
So no one is 100% privileged or 100% oppressed, but these things are interacting with one another constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you care to share?
You touched on something there at the end that I think is really important when you said that no one is 100% privileged or 100% oppressed. It's not a contest, right? It's not a
No,
competition
there's
to
no
decide
hierarchy here.
who's the most oppressed or who's the most privileged. It's just a recognition that all of these different factors play a role in how the world treats people, completely irrespective of who that person is as an individual, right?
Yeah.
And yes, all of these things are part of their identity. But for instance, the thing about differing outcomes in hiring based on a quote white sounding or a quote black sounding name, like that is well documented. And it's been well documented with identical resumes where all they did was change the name,
Yeah.
that they are perceived very differently by hiring managers. And that's just a thing, right? And
And actually, can I add to that real quick? My best friend is a person of color. And so they frequently shorten their name to be less difficult, right? For primarily white people to call it or to call them. And then the other thing is when we are applying for jobs, whether or not we ask for accommodations in our interview process
yep.
or in our application process period, it shouldn't legally impact our ability to get hired. But especially depending on the field we are applying in, if we ask for disability accommodations, it impacts that.
Mm-hmm.
It impacts how people see us.
I have had people say to me, even so, my denomination and its predecessor denominations have now been ordaining women as pastors for 56 years. Right? The first Lutheran women in the US were ordained in 1970. I still have people say to me, well, I just prefer a male pastor. In fact, I had somebody say to me, well, I just know I'm more comfortable with a male pastor than a female pastor. And I know you're married to one, but I'm just glad we got you and not your wife. Folks, my wife is twice the pastor I will ever be, but we also know, even within my denomination that's been ordaining women for 56 years, that on average, my female colleagues with exactly identical qualifications generally tend to get paid between 10 and 15% less with
Yeah.
identical qualifications and experience. And that's just ridiculous to me, especially since if you held a gun to my head and said, name the 10 best pastors, 10 best parish pastors at least 6 of them would be women. Probably more
Yeah.
like 8.
Yeah. Um, oh, where was it gonna go? Um, Backtracking and it's gone. It was another intersection of identity. It's gone. Maybe we'll get back to it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I have become aware of, and this goes back to something we talked about in an earlier episode about empathy and simply being open to hearing and believing the experiences of people who aren't like you. I had no idea what how many of these things were still out there, basically,
Yeah.
until I started talking to and listening to people who aren't like me. When I started hearing from my female colleagues some of the things that are said to them as pastors, and I'm not talking about said to them by misogynistic clergy in denominations that don't ordain women. I'm talking about said to them by members of their own parishes. Like, I was just literally shocked. Um, and
Because you don't have to think about it.
right, exactly.
And
And
that's
that's the
privilege.
definition of privilege, right?
So I remembered what the thing was. And I think in today's episode, especially, I'm going to leave that moment because as we're talking about power, privilege, is informed by how my disability is inform what's happening in my brain. But the thing that I was thinking about is like the things we don't think about as privilege. Was there a library that you could easily access in your hometown?
Mm-hmm.
Did your school have a library?
Mm-hmm.
Did
How well
you
stocked was it?
have, how well stocked was it? Was it up to date? Did you personally, in your home growing up, have books? Did you have someone who was able to read to you? Both in terms of did they have the time, the space, the energy to read to you? And did they know how to read? Because there's a lot of people who make it all the way through high school and they were just passed along. No one ever taught them to read. But also, if you had books in your home growing up, that's a predictor of how you're going to engage with the world and how the world is going to engage with you,
Was your
whether or not you're
school,
literate.
right? Was your school an environment that facilitated learning? I mean, in
Yep.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in the school district of Lancaster, there are, last I checked, 4 schools left in the district that are not air conditioned, which for most of the school year is not a huge problem. But in August, when school starts, and in May, when school is still going on, it's a problem. And those 4 schools that are not air conditioned, oh, look at that. None of them happen to be in the white affluent neighborhoods of town. All 4 of
Yep.
the remaining non-air conditioned schools happen to be in neighborhoods that are majority people of color.
Yeah.
Maybe that's an
And
accident.
it's
I have trouble believing it.
it's also like related to that. In my town where I currently live, there are these like splash parks for kids to go. We
Mhm.
used to have a state pool, which I loved growing up, but sometime when I was a teenager it got removed. But they have all these little splash parks and they're free, they're open access. Why is the only one that doesn't get turned on because someone has to go manually turn them on, the one in the neighborhood that's primarily immigrants and people of color and people with lower socioeconomic status, so
Mhm.
lower economic class?
Mhm.
Like that says something. And it's who has the time and the ability to advocate. It's why do they need to advocate to begin with? Power, privilege, and oppression inform everything, even like obviously the things we don't have to think about are privileged areas, but there I think the one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet that I think is really important in today's society is neither of us have to worry about our police interactions because of the color of our skin.
Right.
Now, I might have to worry because of autism. That's why people started the blue envelope project thing, where you hand your license and or your registration over to the officer in a blue envelope, and it says, "Hey, I'm autistic," and that's supposed to inform how the officer interacts with you versus you having autistic behaviors that aren't socially appropriate or like you just being blunt or seeming disrespectful because it's how you communicate.
Mhm.
And those aren't things that we have to think about. For the most part, I'm able to mask, I'm able to pretend and whatever as an abled person in terms of my autism for the most part. But there are certain things that I can't hide, like when I get out of a car and I've got a cane. Um, I think this goes a little bit back to that sticker I have. I know I don't look disabled. This may surprise you. Most of my body is on the inside where you can't see it because people assume disability looks a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And they tell people like me who have dynamic disabilities, you shouldn't use a wheelchair because once you stop walking, you won't be able to like kind of get that back. It's like, okay, but I have some days where I can barely walk and a wheelchair might benefit me.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have days where I need my cane, but I have to be careful with my cane because my cane will dislocate my elbows. So I have a pair of crutches, but I can't always use the crutches. So, like, we're looking at who has access to what
Right.
mobility aids,
Mm-hmm.
right? And who has access to what care in general. I got there somehow. Oh, through like race and police interactions
Mm-hmm.
and cars. But like how people, how you interact with the everyday world. If I have children, unless I adopt children of color, I don't have to worry about telling them inherently, please be careful about how you interact with the police. I mean, I'm going to have that conversation anyway, because it's important to have that conversation with children at a like age appropriate level or whatever. But I'm going to have that conversation with them about gender and sexuality too, and how people are perceived, even how their peers will perceive me. And there are so many different types of privilege and oppression. We've talked about race, class, ability, um, profession, English speaking in a country we don't have an official language, but like in a country that for some reason favors English, um, being able to speak English
Right.
is something to be considered in this conversation. But there's sizeism. And so like how people see fat people, how people see extremely thin people. And I think what's important in this conversation is to remember that we can't be neutral on a moving train, and how we use our privilege matters.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
to me, one of the clearest examples I've had of how some of this works is, and it's not just like how the person on the street looks at you or talks to you. It's how you get treated by your physician. Okay. And this has happened to both me and my wife. We've both had bariatric surgery. I now weigh about 120 pounds less than I did 4 years ago. The difference in how I am treated, literally treated and, taken seriously by physicians is remarkable. Like, there is a significant difference. Since I, lost 120 pounds, I've not had a doctor dismiss a very serious concern that I had simply by saying, well, you need to exercise more and lose some weight. I used to have that happen quite frequently. Okay. And in fact, the very condition that caused me to put on all of the excess weight, my thyroid taking early retirement and not telling anyone, didn't get diagnosed because a doctor dismissed my concerns and said, well, you just need to, exercise more, eat better, and lose some weight, instead of actually doing the test to find out that, hey, guess what? That's not why I just put on 100 pounds in a year. you know and
yeah.
my wife has said the same thing, that she has had concerns that she took to primary care physicians before gastric bypass and after gastric bypass, and those concerns are received very differently depending on whether the person raising those concerns weighs this amount or this amount.
I mean, I once had a doctor like tell me that my jaw was dislocating because I was fat.
Right. Yeah. uh,
And I want to say, and I think we'll get to kind of an episode on like disability and accessibility, etc. But size is not an indicator of health, and health is not an indicator of value.
Mm-hmm.
So we deserve to be taken seriously, no matter what our size is, no matter what our health status is. We
And
deserve to be taken
also,
seriously in the medical in
yeah,
general.
and also, and this needs to be said as well, someone's size, weight, or body shape is not an indicator of their moral fiber, right? Like people
Yes.
treat excess weight and obesity like a moral failing, and it's not. I mean, I'm no more or less moral now than I was when I weighed 120 pounds more than I do now. But people perceive me in very different ways, and some of that is a moral judgment. And
Yeah.
that's, you know,
Yep.
and having now been on both sides of that, it's so glaringly obvious, and I'm now much more aware of it when I see it being done to people around other identities, whether it's race or class or gender identity or sexuality or those other things. It's like it opened my eyes more to it. And I mean, I was somewhat aware of a lot of this stuff before having gone through that process, but yeah, it's very real if you are willing to open your eyes, pay attention, and listen to and trust the stories of people who live this every day, who have no reason to lie
Yeah.
to you about it.
Yeah. And part of this podcast is about opening people's eyes. And this is a notice that I probably should have given y'all in the first episode. Once you're awake, once you know, you can't go back to sleep. You can't turn off knowing this information. And
You
that's not
choose
a
to
bad
ignore
thing.
it.
But you can choose to ignore it, but choosing ignorance is actually a moral failing,
Mm-hmm.
in
And,
my opinion. I mean,
and if you have a conscience, your conscience will know that you are choosing to not know.
to turn away. Yeah. So I want to say, like, we don't get to choose what privilege we have, but we do get to choose how we use it. And so when we have privilege in certain areas, it's our job to use that privilege. So I think about things like standing up for marginalized and minoritized people and listening to them with about how you do that. So if you and I were in the same space with, say, my my folks, and my folks were misgendering me, and you looked at me and said, "Do you want me to address this?" And I've had someone say that, "Do you want me to address this with your family?" And I got to make the decision. No, at this point, it's not worth the energy expenditure for you to correct them because I'm going to have to deal with that later. But it's also things like if you look at the Black Lives Matter protests, at some point, white folks were told, you need to stand between the police and people of color.
Mm-hmm.
That is how you can use your white privilege in this space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's, as you said, hearing people's experiences. It's also passing the mic when possible or appropriate. So if I'm invited to speak on Black feminisms, but there is a Black woman who is qualified to speak on this topic, my job is to say, hey, this person is more qualified to speak to this issue than I am at this point.
Right.
And I've authored chapters on Black feminisms, or
Mm-hmm.
a chapter on Black feminism, but and it was you like I used primarily Black feminisms in my dissertation, but because of the color of my skin, my job in that situation is to pass the mic.
Right. It's
It's
just like,
to give the other person the opportunity.
right. Every year on or near Trans Day of Visibility, there is a rally at the Pennsylvania State Capitol to encourage the legislature to pass appropriate protections for trans kids in our schools. And every year they manage to not do it. And every year we go back and continue to, you know, advocate loudly for them to do so. And when we go to those things, yeah, I go. And yeah, I put on my collar and I put on my collar and I show up and I do not and will not go to the microphone because that ain't my job. There are plenty of trans people who can articulately speak to that issue, right? I show up and I show up in my collar to stand between them and the people who think they don't belong there, and to say, hey, guess what? In this state where politicians do pay attention to clergy and politicians do pay attention to Christian leaders more than they do to other people, right or wrong, and paying attention to any one citizen more than another, by the way, is wrong in my book. But I've got that privilege. If I can use it on behalf of somebody who doesn't, then yeah, I'm going to show up in my collar.
Yeah. And it's our job to listen to marginalized people about how best to show up for them.
Right. And I, the first time I ever went to one of those rallies on TDOV, I was specifically invited by a trans activist, and I actually asked that question, you know, what's the best way for me to show up? Should I wear my collar, etc.? Should I invite my colleagues and invite them to wear theirs? And their judgment was, yes, please, that would be helpful. That, will send a message to some legislators who unfortunately won't listen to us, but they'll listen to you.
Yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
And another person who was at that event may have had a completely differing opinion from that person.
That's true.
So when you're looking at building affirming spaces, because we talk about everyday actions, something you can do is ask a range of folks.
Right.
In the same way that I can look at you, Bob, and say, you are my ally, I cannot name you an ally for the entire community.
Right.
Also, allyship it's a behavior, it's a thing you do, it's not a thing you are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just throwing that out there. Yeah. Do you have anything before we move on to the next part?
Just to tie in with that of asking multiple people within whatever given community what is most helpful, and you may get answers that are actually directly
Conflict.
conflicting with one another. And hey, guess what? Life is messy. and,
Yep.
and sometimes you have to make the best choice you can based on the information that you know. And you have to be willing that even when you show up and do something that you think is the right thing out of the purest motives and out of the most loving heart you can possibly have, if someone says, hey, that's not helpful, the response is not to become defensive and say, but I meant well. No, the response is to say, okay, what should I do instead? I meant well, help me do it better. Right.
Yeah, and thank them for the correction.
Right. And thank them for the correction and not become defensive about, oh, they didn't like the way I did this.
Yeah.
If the goal is to be helpful, then correction is a good thing.
Yeah.
If the goal is to, get a pat on the back and, hey, look at what a great person I am for helping you, then people get defensive.
I have an example. Because of course I do. We mentioned wheelchairs. If you see a wheelchair user, to not just grab onto their wheelchair and move them, especially without permission. They are not objects, they are human beings. And that would literally be like touching their legs. Don't do the thing.
No,
Don't take their glasses. Like you wouldn't take someone's glasses. Don't jack with someone's wheelchair. Like there are disabled people who have removed the handles or put spikes on the handles of their wheelchairs to deal with this issue. And that should not be required.
no, it should not.
Um,
Like,
it's also we're not afterthoughts as like marginalized people are not afterthoughts. And that's something that we talk a lot about here, where be proactive in your inclusion, in your welcoming, in your affirmation, because we aren't afterthoughts. Book that ASL interpreter for your event. Book the captioner or pay for the captioning for your event. Do something. Make sure that you don't look at a space and go, wow, it's only white people in the room. Well, why? If you've seen that historically, why? Why is
Mhm.
it only white people? Why is it only able people? Who isn't able to be in this space because of the way the system is set up, the way the place is set up, etc. Um, and so that brings me kind of to the next thing, which is isms imply you have power. So reverse sexism, reverse classism, reverse ableism, reverse racism are not possible. Enough. Don't, please don't. Because marginalized, minoritized people do not have the systemic power to inform the policy, to inform what is happening here. So people of color don't have the systemic power to be racist toward white people.
Mhm.
They can be biased, they can be prejudiced, but they don't have that systemic power. So
Right.
reverse racism, not a thing. Reverse
Yeah.
sexism, not a thing. So women and others marginalized based on gender identity cannot be sexist toward men.
Right. And that's another key point is, isms imply systems of power, and that racism is more than just prejudice or bias against people based on their race. It is that prejudice or bias coupled with the power to, inflict harm
Institutionalized.
on a widespread basis. Right.
Yeah. It's institutionally informed. Institutions, schools, churches, governments, those are informed by these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, not answering it. Winnie, can you hear the dogs barking? No? Okay, so we can continue. So, I want to be clear because a little bit of what we talk about next is how those systems of power play a role. So no one is being fired for being straight or cisgender or white, possibly for lying about such things, if that was part of the information that was somehow requested. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, I mentioned that because all I can think of is Rachel Dolezal. I don't know if you remember that name.
I'm vaguely aware of it. Yeah.
White woman pretended to be a person of color to get a high up in an organization for people of color.
Right.
But no one is being fired for being part of an privileged or powerful community or
Right.
a community with power. Um, but people are being attacked for being LGBT, for being disabled, for being poor on an institutional level, on an interpersonal level. And we are carefully taught to hate ourselves if we are going to, look at queer history and look at queers read this from, I want to say 1990. Queer folks and other marginalized folks are carefully taught to hate ourselves for our queerness, for our disability, for being poor, for the things that we don't have access to. And that's something that here at the Affirming Practice Podcast, we want to challenge because no one should be carefully taught to hate themselves for who they are. Um,
Can I add one thing? It's important to recognize that the reason that people are carefully taught to hate themselves for who they are is because somebody profits from it. Okay. There's a reason that poor white people were taught to hate black people in the southern US in the 1700s,
Divide and conquer.
because the white wealthy planter class knew that if the poor white class was venting all of their anger and rage at the poor black population, they wouldn't notice that it was actually the wealthy white planter class who were keeping them poor. I mean,
Yep.
and that's not a
I
political
mean,
statement. That's not my woke agenda. That's called history, folks. And if you'd like references, I can give you books to read.
A People's History of the United States is available entirely for free at historyisaweapon.org. Highly recommend.
That
I'll link
yes.
in the description.
And there are others as well.
Yes, I just really love that one. It was like my Bible in undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what was I going to say? Also, there's things like Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves because of the goodness of his heart.
Mm-hmm.
He freed the slaves because it behooved him. It benefited him to do so. It's a little thing called interest convergence.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's in your history books, folks. Go
Right.
check it out. Those
And
are actual history books, not the white people and the
right.
people who wrote the history books.
And Lincoln was, see, we're in my wheelhouse now because I'm a history geek. And Lincoln was very clear that if he could save the Union without freeing any slaves, he would do that. And if he could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, he would do that. And what's really twisted is that now, like, white Southern apologists or white Confederacy apologists, because not all of them live in the South, white Confederacy apologists who want to claim that the Civil War was not about slavery will point to that as their evidence that the Civil War was not about slavery. Like, no, that's just evidence that Lincoln was going to do whatever he could do to save the Union. If you want evidence that the Civil War was about slavery, please note that literally every single secession declaration from every single state that seceded specifically mentioned slavery. The Civil War was not about states' rights. It was about the rights of wealthy white people to continue treating black people as property and to be able to do that across state lines and into new territories. Period. The end. That's it. The Civil War was about enslaving black people. And if you think it was about anything else, or you're trying to tell people it was about anything else, you are simply lying either to yourself or to them.
Yep.
Get off my soapbox now.
The Before I give us the put it into practice, the thing that comes to mind is when people tell you who they are, believe them.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of what you just described, the states that succeeded told us who they were,
Oh,
or
yeah.
they told us what they were. And so that's something that's important to recognize, is that we believe people not just when they tell us they're being harmed. We believe people when they show us how they're harming others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all right, today's put it into practice. We want you to consider your own identities and positions in relation to power, privilege, and oppression. As we said, no person is 100% privileged or 100% oppressed. So, what does it look like to be aware of your own privileges? What questions do you have about privilege, or how best to use a specific privilege you have to create supportive spaces? We may not be able to answer all of those questions, but we can help facilitate finding those answers.
Mm-hmm.
So please leave them in the link that we have in all of our descriptions that gives you an opportunity to ask questions, because we want your questions, folks. They help us help you.
Right. And, it doesn't, like, I love getting together on Zoom every week and having a conversation with my good friend Diz here. And, like, we'll talk all the live long day, but we want what we talk about to be helpful for you too. And the more feedback we get, the more we can tailor what we're doing to questions that people have. It doesn't matter how
Definitely.
good my answer is if it's not the answer to a question that somebody is wrestling with.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the podcast so far has been like, it's a little bit stemming from one of my syllabi for like an intro to whatever topic class in terms of gender and sexuality and disability, but it's based off of our experiences and what we've had to learn as people with certain privileges and with certain identities that are marginalized or minoritized. Do you have anything to add before we close out this episode?
No, other than just to remind people that they are indeed deeply and profoundly loved.
They are indeed. And you are too important not to take care of yourselves, folks. So go forth, be safe. Let us know what your thoughts are. We want to hear from you. And until next time, this has been the Affirming Practice Podcast. We'll see you later. Bye. Give me 1 sec.